It is Friday night. Your choice of beverages, we can't tell. Get comfortable, and thank you for joining us at the end of what might have been a long week. You know, here in New Hampshire, we've had weather. I guess we usually have weather here in New Hampshire. Bedford, New Hampshire, Manchester. Okay, it looks like we slowed down now. Excellent. All right, well, welcome everyone. I am Michael Haley Goldman. I am the Executive Director of New Hampshire Humanities. I'm so pleased that you're joining us for Humanities at Home again tonight. This is the January edition of New Hampshire Humanities program. The program for tonight is Between Justice and Goodness, Conflicting Duties in the Face of Climate Change. Climate change is a challenge for all of us, and understanding the data and what it might mean for our planet's future as we grapple with individual choices is really the topic for tonight. What's the possible impact or importance? It can seem like one problem after another with no clear answers. So we're really glad to help you think about not the climate science, but thinking about actually your role in how we think about this morally and ethically. What are the duties of individuals in the face of a warming world? Duties is a word that's very specific to the work that our guest tonight is working with. Drawing on the concepts of the tools of moral philosophy, Dr. Josh Duclos will discuss the distinction between justice and goodness as a framework for personal duty that can be used to address issues such as who owes what to whom and why. We're going to focus on the moral dimensions and personal responsibility, and we'll also consider and challenge proposals from philosophers, economists, and policy specialists. So this is really all over the map in terms of different types of perspectives on the discussion. For the last 50 years, New Hampshire Humanities have been connecting people to culture, history, places, and ideas. And I say that because this is our 50th anniversary, so we're glad you're joining us for programs in our 50th year. Each month this year, this program, Humanities at Home, will highlight topics that we've addressed at various points during our past. Back in 1974, right after the creation of New Hampshire Humanities, we funded Energy, the Individual, and the Community, and it was a program that looked at the intersection of environmental and energy policy and the personal choices and values that were inherent in environmental policy discussions. So in some sense, you think about the oil crisis of 1973 and how we had discussions at that point in time about what policy choices were and what individual choices were. We're really glad to bring that forward to today, 50 years later, to talk about similar issues as we're looking at justice and goodness and how we face climate change. So this program is made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we do want to make sure we thank them every time we do this. We also want to thank you because this program is made possible by many of you out there on the call tonight, and we really do appreciate that. Each year, we do a huge number of programs. This past year, we've done more than 1,206 programs that are free to the public that serves people all over the state. All 10 counties, 181 different communities, more than 33,000 people have come to programs that we have either held ourselves, like tonight, or that we've done with partners, more than 400 partners in your own hometown. So the way we work is through not only doing these kinds of programs, but by working with those organizations close to you, your library, your historical society, your community center. And so we do thank them as our partners, and we thank you for supporting us. If you want to find out more about all the things happening around the state, I do encourage you to go to our website, nhhumanities.org, where you can find out more, sign up for the newsletter so you can get it delivered to your email, or help us by supporting us. So without further ado on these things, a little bit of the ground rules for tonight. We do want you to participate. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Hopefully you've gotten so used to Zoom by now, you don't have to look for it very hard. We expect you to put questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Our events are governed by the general rules of respectful civil discourse, and it is expected that any comments and questions, whether typed in the chat or expressed verbally, will be based on the content of the program to further a productive conversation between participants, presenters, and NHH staff. So please play by those rules. Use the Q&A box. If you do have problems with seeing the program or any other kind of questions, you can also use the chat feature, and our staff will be there to help you. Those are the ground rules. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Josh Duclos holds a degree in philosophy from the University of Chicago and Boston University. He specializes in ethics and environmental philosophy and is the author of Wilderness, Morality, and Value, which came out in 2022. I've not read the book, but I've been reading reviews of it since we booked Josh to come on the program, and it really is a fascinating sounding book, really digging into this issue of how we look at wilderness and the concept of it. And what I've learned from reading the reviews is this is an area that there's not been a huge amount of work in. So it's exciting to see this area really being developed and explored. Dr. Duclos is former Fulbright scholar and a dedicated teacher, and he currently teaches humanities and philosophy just down the road here in Concord, New Hampshire at St. Paul's School. And so, Dr. Duclos, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks to New Hampshire Humanities for inviting me, and thanks to everyone who's taken some time this evening to join us. I'm just going to jump right into it. Between justice and goodness, conflicting duties in the face of climate change. So I'd like to start with a couple facts. Here's the first fact. Anthropogenic climate change is real. What do I mean when I say that? Well, by anthropogenic climate change, I mean that certain changes in the climate are the result of human behaviors, particularly the release of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and methane. And today I'll talk specifically about carbon. The map you've got on the screen right now is showing global temperature deviations from 1951 to 1980. And the places in darker red are where the temperature has gone up. This is a map that's probably familiar to many of you. It's nothing groundbreaking. So why has human behavior been affecting climate change? Like I said, a lot of this has to do with carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, which when it gets into the atmosphere tends to make the atmosphere retain more heat. So for the last 500,000 years or so, the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere was between 200 and 300. And for the 10,000 years before the Industrial Revolution, the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere was about 275. In May of 2023, the parts per million stood at 424. So it's a significant deviation. This chart actually is probably the best representation that I can show people. And it shows that while the temperature of the atmosphere does fluctuate over time, there's something really statistically significant that's happened in the last 100 and then the last 50 years. So human behavior, human consumption of fossil fuels is driving a kind of climate change. I take that as a fact. If there's reason to challenge that, maybe we can get into it later in the presentation. Okay, now here's another fact. So anthropogenic climate change is happening. Human behavior is affecting climate change. The next fact is that anthropogenic climate change, or ACC, is causing harm. The harm takes a lot of forms. It's extreme weather or unpredictable weather, flooding, droughts, heat waves, damage to ecosystems, loss of species, acidification of the oceans, and the desertification of arable land. How does all that create harm? A number of ways. Malnutrition, enormous increase in respiratory diseases around the world, enormous increases in diarrheal diseases. The ranges for tropical diseases like malaria and dengue fever increase. But maybe the most significant way that ACC, or anthropogenic climate change, causes harm is with poverty. So the Stern Review from 2006, which is, I think, still the best economic analysis of the effects of climate change, predicts that ACC is going to diminish the world's economic production at least 5% and as much as 20%. So to the extent that causing someone to live in poverty is a way of causing them harm, then it's a pretty clear indicator that anthropogenic climate change is causing harm. All right. So two facts that I presented, that anthropogenic climate change is a real phenomenon and that it is causing harm. And so if we then shift to the moral dimension, we might want to say, can we make an immediate moral inference to those facts, the facts of anthropogenic climate change? Do they lead us to an obvious moral imperative? And I tend to think that a lot of the political rancor about this subject boils down to this fact that people assume if you either accept or reject these facts, you are then locked into a very particular moral or political conclusion. So let's think about that. Do the facts of anthropogenic climate change lead to an obvious moral imperative? And I think this is the most important slide that I have to show. No, no, they do not. They absolutely do not. And that is not to say that there's not important moral and political considerations to have. If there wasn't, I'd have nothing to talk about. But there is no immediate moral inference from the fact of climate change or even the fact of harm to what we should do. So let me explain a little bit why I say no there. The acceptance of a fact, any fact, never constitutes a moral imperative, never. So here's a silly example. Cats like to chase mice. That's a fact. Cats like chasing mice. Does that fact lead to any kind of obvious moral imperative? What would the therefore be? Therefore, we should provide the cats with more mice. Therefore, we should keep the mice away from the cats. Therefore, we should set up a live stream so we can watch the cats chase the mice. I mean, there's no obvious normative conclusion just from a fact. Where facts are essential in making any kind of moral argument is that they hold a very particular place in the argument, but you actually need to construct the argument itself. You cannot throw down a fact and then immediately infer the moral imperative. Let me try to unpack that a little bit. So here's a very basic structure for moral arguments. I have it set up as a three-part argument, a basic syllogism, a couple premises, and a conclusion. And most moral arguments actually work this way. You begin with a very particular factual claim. And that's one of your premises. Then you add another premise that's a universal moral principle. You invoke some sort of moral principle. Then by putting those two together, you try to infer what you think is a particular moral judgment. So here's a silly example I've got on the screen. Kicking someone in the shins causes them pain. That's a fact. Next premise, invoke some kind of principle. It's wrong to cause someone pain without a good reason. Now, if I'm confident in the truth of one and I'm confident in the truth of two, I think I can draw a conclusion there. I could say, I should not kick people in the shin just because I'm bored, assuming that boredom doesn't constitute a good reason to cause someone pain. So you take a fact, you add it to some sort of universal principle, and then you try to reach some sort of moral conclusion. So if we want to build a moral argument from anthropogenic climate change, we can do that. We begin with those facts. Human activity is causing climate change, and we know that anthropogenic climate change is causing harm. But then we'd have to think about what moral principles we want to invoke to construct our argument. And there's many. Here's just a few examples. One might be, we should avoid actions that cause unjust harm to others. Or maybe you think we should make restitution to those whom we have harmed. Or we should help those who are being harmed. These are all different universal moral principles that you could reach to in trying to construct a moral argument about climate change. So if we're going to make an argument, it might look something like this. And this is just one example. There's many moral arguments from climate change that you could make. But how about this? Premise one, anthropogenic climate change harms human beings, and much of the harm is undeserved. Premise two, actions that cause undeserved harm without offering proper compensation are unjust. And if you're confident in one, and if you're confident in two, you can then infer that contributing to anthropogenic climate change is going to be unjust. So what do I mean that anthropogenic climate change harms human beings and much of the harm is undeserved? Why do I throw in that undeserved there? Sometimes there's harm or pain that happens to a person, and you might think, well, it's not actually an instance of injustice, that for some reason the person might deserve the pain or might deserve the punishment. But let's take Tuvalu as an example, which is a small island chain in the South Pacific. As a result of anthropogenic climate change, Tuvalu is actually disappearing. Sea levels are rising and the islands are disappearing, and it's not inconceivable that the islands themselves are going to disappear. I think it's pretty clear that for anyone who lives on these islands, makes their living there, works there, grew up there, wants to continue living there, this constitutes a form of harm. Why is the harm particularly undeserved in this case, that they're suffering a form of harm that they really don't deserve? Well, the harm is coming as a result of anthropogenic climate change, and that's driven by excess use of fossil fuels. The changes that are happening and the harm that's happening in a place like Tuvalu, the residents of Tuvalu themselves are utterly insignificant actors in causing the problem. They're suffering the repercussions, but they are not the ones responsible for it. So if someone could show that they had some fossil fuel burning factory on Tuvalu that's fundamentally responsible for sea level rise, you might say, well, hey, that's their problem. The harm they're experiencing, they deserve. But it tends to be that the people performing the actions that create the harm are usually not the ones who experience the harm that results from their actions. Okay, so now that we've kind of laid out how you go from particular facts about climate change and then how you might begin making a moral argument about them, some questions come up. And the big question for me is, what moral responsibility do individuals have in the face of climate change? Not states, not the UN, not the World Economic Forum, but you and me as individuals. Then we might want to ask, how can individuals meet their personal moral responsibilities? We want to know what we owe and to whom it's owed, and whether there are different ways we could meet these moral responsibilities if we think they exist. Oops. Well, what I want to present now is an analysis of this problem that comes from a really superb philosopher and economist named John Broome, who's working at Oxford University for many years, and he wrote a book called "Climate Matters: Ethics in a Warming World," and I strongly recommend it to everyone. And I want to try to work through his argument, and I see my role now really as an educator. I'm not necessarily advocating this analysis. I'm actually going to try to remain neutral on most of the controversial points, but it is an important way of thinking about the problem, and I'd like to present it and allow you to draw your own conclusions. So John Broome thinks it's important for us to think about the difference between duties of goodness and duties of justice. So what is the difference? For moral philosophers, if you believe in a duty of goodness, you basically believe that human beings have a duty to make the world better, to do good in the world. Now, what do we mean by better? I think for now, the best thing is to be pluralists about goodness and say there are many ways to make the world better. You could create a beautiful painting, and that makes the world a better place. You could contribute to the sum of human knowledge. You could care for an elderly neighbor, share your money with those in need, adopt a pet. There are many, many ways to potentially make the world better. So if you think there's a duty of goodness, you believe that you somehow have a duty to make the world a better place. An interesting feature of duties of goodness is that it's not a duty to any specific action or any specific person. So you could, if you believe there are duties of goodness, that you as an individual have a duty of goodness, you could meet that duty by becoming a pediatrician and giving healthcare to children, or you could meet that duty by becoming a plumber. And if you've ever needed a plumber, you understand why plumbers make the world a better place. You also don't have a duty to any specific person. You could meet a duty of goodness by being a pediatrician and working in New Hampshire, or by working in Costa Rica. You could meet your duty of goodness by providing excellent plumbing services in New Hampshire or in Vermont. So duties of goodness aren't specific to actions, and they aren't specific to people. It really just says that you have a duty to try and make the world better if you can. Duties of justice are very different. A duty of justice is that to which another has a right. It's that which you actually owe another, and they have a right to demand from you. A duty of justice is not just something that it would be nice to have. So here's a couple examples. Most of us have 2 kidneys, and almost all of us need only 1 kidney. And right now, there are thousands of people in the United States, tens of thousands in the world, maybe millions in the world, who really need an extra kidney in order to live. And most of us have an extra one that we don't need. Now, would it be a good thing? Would you be making the world better in some sense? Would it be an act of kindness and beneficence for you to take one of your unneeded kidneys and give it to one of these people who really needs ones? And I would say yes. I mean, what a magnificent thing that would be for someone to do. But do you have a duty of justice? Does someone who you've never met and you don't know, do they have a right to demand your kidney just because they need it and you've got an extra one? And I would say no, they don't. So if you want to happen to give away one of your extra kidneys, that would be a form of goodness, but you wouldn't be meeting any kind of duty of justice. Contrast that with broken windows. Um, let's see. When I was growing up playing baseball in the backyard, every once in a while a ball would go stray, and in at least one memorable occasion, we broke a neighbor's window. Now, my siblings and I had a duty of justice to fix that window, to own up to what we did, and then find the money to somehow fix that window. That person had a right to expect that from us. We had harmed them or their house or their window in some kind of way, and it was our responsibility to take care of it. But that did not mean we then had to roam the neighborhood looking for all broken windows and think that we could somehow fix them, and that it was our responsibility. Had we done that, I suppose that would have been a kind of goodness. It would have been making the world a better place, helping people fix their broken windows. But the duty of justice is invoked when someone else has a right to demand it from you, and when you really owe it to that other person. So this is John Broom's book that I mentioned, Climate Matters: Ethics in a Warming World. And in addition to making this distinction between duties of justice and duties of goodness, Broom argues that when it comes to anthropogenic climate change, almost all of us are in a situation where we have a duty of justice. That it's not a matter of whether we want to try to make the world better just because we're a good person and do something about climate change, that we're actually in a situation much more like having broken a neighbor's window and needing to make restitution. So why does Broom think this? Broom thinks that our emissions are fundamentally unjust. And by our, I'm including me in this. This would be anyone who emits, anyone who's a net emitter. Your emissions are unjust. Why are they unjust? First, they cause demonstrable harm to other people. Second, that harm is undeserved. You're harming someone who doesn't deserve to be harmed. Third, the harm is uncompensated. It's not as if you are harming them and then writing them a check. And finally, justice demands that our carbon footprint be zero unless we are willing to make restitution to the harmed parties. That's where Broom ends up. Going back to my silly window example, it would be as if you're playing backyard baseball and you're constantly breaking windows. You'd be in a situation where if you were going to continue to do that, at a bare minimum, you have got to go around to the homes whose windows you have broken and say, look, I'm willing to pay for this. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to make it right. So Broom's going to argue, unless an individual is willing to get their carbon footprint down to zero, you are in a situation where you're causing harm. The harm is undeserved, the harm is unjust, and you now have a duty of justice, and you need to figure out how to meet it. All right, now a lot of questions for Dr. Broom, I imagine, and we're going to try to go through them. We might wonder, how are my emissions causing harm? You know, I drive to work. What do you mean I'm harming someone? Why do my emissions have to be zero? Why can't I just, slightly reduce my carbon footprint? We might ask, why can't I do good in some other way, right? Why can't I just be a good person or work for Doctors Without Borders? Why do I have to get my net emissions to zero? And then if you're on board with the argument that Broom makes, you might say, all right, well, how do I actually do that? How do I get my emissions to zero? Or if I can't, how do I make restitution? The World Health Organization estimates that those emissions alone cost an individual 6 months of healthy life. So someone somewhere has had their life reduced by 6 months because of your lifetime emissions or because of my lifetime emissions. An individual's yearly emissions, it's estimated, shortens someone's life by a few days. Now, I take that as the clearest, most basic form of harm. If you're shortening someone's life, if you're taking away their capacity for living and for anything good, it's quite clearly a form of harm to them. Now, duties of justice, unlike duties of goodness, do need an identifiable victim. So a duty of goodness you could meet, and it doesn't have to be towards any particular person. But with a duty of justice, it's always that which someone has a right to demand from you. So there has to be some clear someone. So who's the victim with anthropogenic climate change? I mean, who have I, for example, as an emitter harmed such that I owe them restitution? Now, it's certainly true that there's going to be minuscule harm from my particular emissions to any one particular individual. And it will actually be quite difficult to figure out how my particular emissions are going to cause any particular individual harm. But here's what should be clear. It's overwhelmingly likely that my emissions are contributing to the harm experienced by many individuals. Let me try an analogy here. So got a little illustration of a farm and fertilizer. And let's say this is your farm, or let's say it's my farm. And I'm using a kind of fertilizer that is known to create health problems for anyone who comes in contact with it. And it seeps into the river and it goes downstream. But let's say I'm not the only one with a farm there, and I'm not the only one using this fertilizer. There's a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen farms all in the same area. They're all using the same fertilizer that tends to cause health problems for people. The fertilizer goes into the river, it goes downstream. And let's say kids downstream start getting sick. It's going to be impossible to figure out if it was a molecule from the fertilizer on my farm that caused the harm versus whether it was a molecule of fertilizer from someone else's farm. So it is true that you'll never be able to actually jump from your particular emissions to the harm experienced by some individual. But what would be totally clear in this case of the farms is that you are morally culpable along with the other people polluting in that way. So maybe it's not worth worrying about whether you can find the one person in the world who is harmed by your emissions. Your emissions, my emissions, mixed with many other people, contribute to the harm that's happening, even if we can't totally disentangle it. All right, so the victim here, the victim then, as Broome sees it, would be anyone suffering the adverse effects of climate change without significantly contributing to climate change and without being justly compensated. Sometimes people would want to ask, can I offset my emissions by doing good, right? So let's say I acknowledge that I'm an emitter. I acknowledge that emissions cause harm. I acknowledge that anthropogenic climate change is real. But then I think, hold on, I volunteer at the soup kitchen. I donate to Doctors Without Borders. I look after my elderly neighbors. I'm kind to stray pets. Isn't that good enough? Aren't I a good person? But it's not really clear that goodness cancels out injustice. So let's say I'm in a particularly bad mood, and at work one day I decide to kick someone in the shins. And it makes me feel better, so I kick someone else in the shins the next day. But upon reflection, I realize that this sort of kicking people just because I'm having a bad day, it's not really a fair thing to do, and I shouldn't do it. So I've done something wrong. I've made the world a more negative place. And what I decide to do is send flowers to someone at the hospital who maybe hasn't had a visitor in a while. Now, that would be a really good thing to do, right? I kicked one of my colleagues in the shins. I feel bad about it. So I decide to send flowers to a patient in the hospital who hasn't had any visitors. That's nice, but it doesn't really meet my duty of justice. When you harm a particular individual, the only way to make recompense is to address them. So what I would need to do is apologize to my colleagues, promise not to go around kicking people again, or something like that, or maybe send them flowers. So Broome's idea here is that you can't erase a duty of justice that you've incurred by just promising to be a good person in some other way. All right, how would I get my emissions to zero? Because this seems somewhat impractical. You don't eat meat, no cars, no air travel. You'd probably have to commit to not having children because that's in some ways the worst thing you could do for climate change. Broome is going to say this is totally unrealistic and it comes at an enormous cost. Emissions are not evil. Fossil fuels themselves are not evil. Technologically advanced, carbon emitting societies are producers of enormous good in the world. They're producers of enormous progress. And the idea that we're going to go back to some pre-industrial utopia is, one, completely unrealistic, but it's also a little short-sighted, because most pre-industrial utopias were rarely utopian for all members. So Broome doesn't think that's the way to go. It's not to go back to being hunters and gatherers. What Broome suggests is that we engage in carbon offsetting. What is offsetting? Offsetting is when you cause a unit of greenhouse gas to be subtracted from the atmosphere for every unit you emit. So the idea here is no matter how much you emit, if you are causing some other unit to come out, your net emissions become zero. There's two forms of offsetting. One's called removal offsetting, which is where you try to directly take the carbon out of the atmosphere. Sometimes this is done with planting trees. That's actually not a great strategy as removal offsetting. It becomes a zero-sum game. Trees can be carbon sinks. They can store carbon, but then trees die, decay, release all the carbon back into the atmosphere. So it ends up being a wash. Carbon capture technology is a really promising way to go for removal offsetting, but at least currently, it's quite expensive. It's still in some ways scientifically unproven, and it's not something that most individuals have access to. So what Broome recommends to meet this duty of justice vis-a-vis climate change, assuming you agree that you have some duty of justice vis-a-vis climate change, is preventive offsetting. Preventive offsetting is exactly what it sounds like. You prevent greenhouse gas that would otherwise be emitted from ever being emitted. So an individual is able to have their emissions offset by essentially paying to ensure that someone else, somewhere else, ultimately emits less. So I would continue to emit whatever I emit, but if I believe I've incurred this duty of justice because my emissions are causing harm, what I do is I find a way to get someone else, somewhere else, to emit less. And then at the end of the day, my net contributions are zero. All right, this is a wind turbine, obviously, but it's actually a wind turbine from a wind farm in North Dakota that Boston University, where I used to work, is getting a lot of its energy. So Boston University, like many institutions, has made a commitment to be carbon neutral in the near future. But interestingly, Boston University is going to continue to burn as many fossil fuels as it always has. So how could Boston University ever become carbon neutral? Well, through preventive offsetting. What it's done is it's funded a wind farm in North Dakota. And so a number of people in North Dakota who would have been getting their energy through traditional fossil fuels and emitting enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, now they won't, because Boston University has provided this wind farm. But Boston University is going to continue to emit as it always has. But because it's helped others prevent their future emissions, Boston University hopes to claim that it will one day be carbon neutral. Another really popular way to engage in preventive offsetting is with efficient cook stoves, particularly in Southeast Asia and in parts of Africa. A surprising amount of climate change and health respiratory problems come from indoor cooking and using particularly inefficient cook stoves. So there's a number of companies that help fund very efficient, very clean personal cooking stoves that cut emissions. And so if you were someone interested in trying to get to net zero, what you could do is fund and provide these efficient cook stoves to people in other places. You continue to live and emit just as you do, but because others are emitting less, your contributions drop to net zero. All right, now, again, I am just presenting this argument. I'm trying to walk through it and talk through it. I'm not pushing it on anyone. I'm not arguing against it. I'm not arguing for it. I'm just trying to engage with it. So let's say you agree. You agree that ACC is causing harm. You agree that the harm is unjust. You agree that because you're the one helping to cause some of this harm, you've incurred a duty of justice, and you think you should do something about it. How does that actually work? There's many companies, and here's just one I want to show you quickly, TerraPass. TerraPass is for people who want to preventively offset their carbon footprint. So what do? Well, you calculate your carbon footprint, you purchase carbon offsets, the company then funds the carbon reduction projects, and hopefully you meet your duty of justice. So I ran through this for myself, and for an individual, one car, not much of a commute, a few other factors go in there. It turns out that I emit almost 3,000 pounds of carbon dioxide a year. And to offset that, to preventively offset that so that my net contribution would be zero, TerraPass is able to do that for $21.85 a month. If I go for the subscription, if I just do it on a month by month, it would be $23.30. Now, if you happen to really like this idea, there's various gift bundles that you can work with. You can make personal gifts to other people and help them offset their carbon. You can give people green wedding carbon credits. You can offset particular flights and deal with your travel and your tourism. And the whole idea is that you are not actually changing what you do. You're not emitting any less, but somehow, because of your preventive offsetting, no additional carbon is actually being added to the atmosphere. So a few numbers that are interesting to look at. The average American emits 14.4 tons of CO2 a year. And if you happen to want to offset this through TerraPass, which does it at about $10 a ton, you're looking at about $140 a year. By way of comparison, so $140 for the average American to offset their carbon. The average household expends about $560 on streaming services. The average American spends about $750 on coffee in a given year. And in a given year, the average American spends about $840 on their cell phone bill. So just by way of comparison, at least currently, if you want to engage in this preventive offsetting and you think you have a duty to do so, it's actually not an enormous financial burden relative to the other things people tend to spend money on. All right, now, I strongly suspect that in listening to me quickly go through this argument, there have been a number of concerns and a number of people shaking their head and maybe even wondering what I'm possibly talking about or what this guy Broom is on about. So there are a number of concerns with this approach. You might say, is it right to buy our way out of environmental responsibility? Basically, throw down your credit card to take care of your carbon. You might wonder, does preventive offsetting encourage continued overconsumption? You just consume more and then buy your way out of it. It's fair to ask if this kind of offsetting actually makes anybody more environmentally virtuous. We could ask if we can really trust these offsetting companies or if the whole thing's a scam. One that I think is important to ask, doesn't this disproportionately burden the poor if we think people are accruing these duties of justice and the way to solve it is to buy your way out of it? And then fundamentally, maybe the big question is, will this solve climate change? Does this kind of preventive offsetting solve the problems of climate change? Let me try to quickly go through some of these points. So is it right to buy our way out of our environmental responsibility? Here's what Broom would say on this. Fundamentally, whether you change your lifestyle and get your net contribution to zero, or you engage in preventive offsetting, the effect on climate change is the exact same. It really is. So it all depends on what a person means by right. Is it right to do this? But from the standpoint of utilitarian ethics, where we're just looking at maximizing the good in the world, this is just as good a way to do it as any other way. And Broom would argue that this is actually probably the most effective way to reduce harm. You'd have to think about the kind of lifestyle changes it would take to truly get your contributions to zero. And if you believe that emissions of any form cause some form of harm to actual people, to avoid that harm, to avoid that duty of justice, you really do need to get your contributions to zero. It's almost inconceivable that through any behavioral changes you could get there. So Broom would say, yeah, this is right, and it's actually the most efficient way to do it. All right, the question about whether this just encourages overconsumption, right? You think well, I'll just keep taking these expensive transatlantic flights and then I'll buy my way out of it. I suppose it's possible, but it's also worth noting that a system like this could discourage overconsumption. If people do come to the view that they hold some duty of justice here, and you can even imagine this becoming legally codified, I mean, a sort of carbon tax that individuals are taxed for the amount of carbon because of the harm it does to other people. What happens then is it's going to actually discourage overconsumption because it's hitting you in the wallet. carbon dioxide at that point becomes a cost that's borne by the people who emit it rather than an externality. In economics, an externality is a feature of a certain behavior that does have an economic cost, but the consumer themselves doesn't bear that economic cost. If we either happen to believe or get in a situation where we're legally required to pay for our emissions, that's what's going to stop a certain form of overconsumption, because you're not going to want to pay for it. Finally, though, on this, Broom would say, maybe worrying about overconsumption is the wrong thing, that you can consume all you want as long as you're willing to offset, because the goal for him is to get people to have their contributions be net zero. So consume if that's what you want to do, as long as you then offset. All right. Many environmental thinkers are bothered by this whole approach of buying our way out of an environmental problem, and they wonder if this is really the way to become more environmentally conscious and make people more environmentally virtuous. You can think of people like Rachel Carson or John Muir or Thoreau just being appalled by this way of thinking of things. And the answer is no. I don't think preventive offsetting makes anyone more environmentally virtuous. But then we'd have to figure out what the goal is in this sort of behavior. And I think it's possible to entertain the idea that maybe we need less environmental virtue signaling, right? Less inspirational bumper stickers about, how the earth doesn't belong to us, we belong to the earth, and more things that actually reduce unjust harm. So, here's an example. You can imagine someone who shops at Whole Foods because they think it's more sustainably sourced and Whole Foods has little ethical labels on their products, but this person never engages in offsetting. Versus a person who shops at Market Basket, which, at least so far as I'm aware, doesn't promise any sort of environmentally virtuous products, but that person does engage in offsetting. I would argue that the second person who shops at Market Basket and offsets is actually doing more to meet their duty of justice and reduce the harm that's being done to actual individuals. So the response here would really be, if you want to improve your virtue, that's great, but don't focus on improving your environmental virtue at the expense of meeting your duty of justice. Here's the skeptical question about these companies. And I often get this response from students. Their response is, look, can we trust these companies? It seems like a scam. How do we know they're doing anything? The response to this is just put in your due diligence, as it is with any charity. Don't give money to anyone or any institution without being fairly certain that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. So that's a basic point. But I would say the extreme skepticism that people have about whether these companies do what they say they're going to do is just totally unjustified. I know a lot of people who regularly play the lottery, regularly play Powerball. I don't know anyone who's actually won it. I don't know anyone who knows anyone who's actually won it. And I certainly don't know anyone who's seen someone win the lottery and then actually cash the check and then actually get it. So then why do people keep playing the lottery if they don't have absolute hardcore scientific proof that this isn't all a scam? Well, because we have a lot of just sort of conventional evidence that it's not a scam and that it does work. So it would be a little weird when someone makes an argument suggesting that you have a duty of justice vis-a-vis climate change and that you may need to engage in preventive offsetting and that you could use a company to do it. And then suddenly you become an enormous skeptic and think that these companies are just running a scam and you can't trust them. So put in your diligence, but the extreme skepticism seems a bit self-serving. I think this is the most significant concern with Broom's approach, and it's the idea that preventive offsetting as a way of meeting a duty of justice will disproportionately burden the poor. And I think the answer has to be yes. Yes, it just simply will. If we believe that emitters incur a duty of justice, and if the most efficient, or in some ways the only way to meet that duty of justice is to use money to engage in preventive offsetting, then those with more money are in an advantageous position. But there's nothing unique about that fact in preventive offsetting. It's always easier for the wealthy to meet their duty of justice. So let's say a person of wealth and means incurs a parking ticket. They park where they're not supposed to, and now they have some duty of justice to pay the city or the state a fine, it's always going to be easier for someone with more money to meet that duty of justice than with someone with less money. So while this is a really important feature of the potential solution, it's nothing unique to this. It merely points out that the poor have disproportionate burdens when compared to the rich. One last thing to note, though, is that while offsetting could disproportionately burden the poor, offsetting might also disproportionately benefit the poor. As many people here know, I'm sure, it tends to be the poor and those who are worst off who are disproportionately affected by climate change. So to the extent that we're able to either prevent or slow or even turn back some of the most negative effects of climate change, those who are going to be most benefited would be the poor. All right, and the last question here. Will offsetting solve climate change? Is this a way to solve our climate crisis? Has Dr. John Broome given us the solution? No, no, he absolutely hasn't, and nor does he think he has, to be fair to him. He has not. First, everyone can't offset. Offsetting is a zero-sum game. For any individual to be able to offset, what you're doing is continuing to emit as you always do, and you're paying someone else somewhere else to emit less. Everyone can't actually engage in preventive offsetting. So this is not a long-term solution. This is a very short-term solution. Furthermore, this is in no way a solution to the general climate crisis. That's going to take coordinated state action, coordinated international action, coordinated corporate action. There's frankly nothing individuals can do in their own private life to significantly solve the problems related to climate change. So then why is Broome talking about it then? Again, this goes back to the idea of duties of justice. If you agree with the idea that causing undeserved harm to another person is unjust, whether it's kicking them in the shin, breaking their window, or engaging in behavior that actually shortens their life, if you believe that is unjust, and then if you come to also believe that your actions are partially responsible for causing that harm, it's very hard to escape the view that you actually do have a duty of justice, that your behavior is causing harm to others. And you have two options. You either cease that behavior immediately, which in this case would be cease emitting. That seems highly impractical, and it may not actually be the best thing to do. So then the only thing you can do is find a way to offset the harm you're doing. So this preventive offsetting is a way for individuals to try and meet their duties of justice. But it certainly would not be a way to solve any sort of global climate crisis. That's all I've got. It's a lot of information. I hope it wasn't too much all at once, but thank you very much for listening. And I'd be happy now to get into some discussion.
Thanks, Josh. This is a lot to take in, and I'm going to encourage. We've got some great questions in the Q&A already. I'm going to encourage people who are still having thoughts to take a moment and get the questions in. And since some of the questions came up, I think before you started going into some of your concerns about the way that the argument is made, if you put in a question and now you want to rethink any pieces of that, that's also a chance to do that. While people are thinking about that, I think one of the things I wanted to ask about, and taking moderator privilege on this, is you mentioned doing something along these lines with your students. And I think it's really interesting to think about how students respond to this kind of discussion, partially because I think for many people in the public, moral philosophy is not something that feels very approachable. So I think what kind of conversations come out of this, and how much do your students, after they think about the way you've taken a look at this article, this particular book and the arguments in it, how much are they able to apply some of these ideas to other things that they're wrestling with?
Yeah, two thoughts on that. The first reaction, and I'm speaking from students in general, not any particular group of students, but the first reaction students tend to have is one of resistance. And maybe a lot of people have this, that they feel like they're being accused of something. And then when they feel like they're being accused of something, then they start to think that they're being told they're not good people and that they have to do something to make them good people. And it's a really natural way to understand this, that you're being accused of being an emitter, and now you've got to figure out how to fix that. I think Broom, whatever anyone thinks of the merits or demerits of his arguments, is really careful to put out that this is not a judgment about human beings at all. It's not a judgment about whether you are a good or bad person. It's trying to start with a fact that you are emitting and emissions cause harm. And if you believe that you are causing harm to another person without making recompense, then it's really not a huge logical leap to say you owe that person something. The other thing I try to say to students is what you then do, how you choose to meet that or what you choose to think about that is a separate practical issue from understanding how the argument works and applying it, right? You could agree with everything Broom says and say, yeah, but at the end of the day, I just don't care. And that's fine. You're completely free to do that. But don't sidetrack the argument just because you don't like what it might encourage you to do. And then as for applying it to other things, I think it's really essential to hammer home the point that facts themselves do not carry moral implications. They just don't. Facts always have to be put into some kind of argument. You cannot throw out a fact and then immediately say, therefore, one should. You really have to take the time to build the argument. And a lot of disagreements people have about say, the politics or ethics of climate change, it's much easier to sort out if you actually build an argument because you can figure out, well, look, I'm disagree with you about premise one, or I disagree with you about premise two, or frankly, I don't think the inference to the conclusion follows. But until you get an argument on the board, all we're doing is throwing emotions back and forth, frankly.
Sorry, I forgot that I was being good and muted myself during that. I'm going to jump to the questions. We've got a good number of questions, and I'm going to try to condense because some people are asking about similar things. I'm going to start with one from Marcia, who was saying that they appreciated the focus on individuals and that it's often hard to think about our own part in climate change, but also wondering about corporate emissions. How do we work with to publicize and change a corporation's emissions or pollutants? How does that fit into some of this discussion? Does that work as a duty of justice?
Yeah, well, so the argument and the ideas I presented and in Broom's book and his argument, that's not something he considers. So I guess I would say whatever fundamental solution or mitigative strategy there's going to be for most of the problems associated with climate change is going to have to be at the state level, the international level, and the corporate level. And then those are going to involve policy discussions. And I don't want to say too much about that because I don't really have expertise there. And I would just be sort of mimicking what I read in the New York Times or in the Wall Street Journal. Um, um, the idea here is that a duty of justice is not something that an individual really ought to avoid because they think it doesn't solve some sort of greater problem, or because they think they think that coordinated action is the only thing that's going to fix it. Just going back to my silly analogy of the broken windows, if you break someone else's window or you bump into someone else's car, what a weird thing it would be to say, well, in this city, there's thousands of cars that have been bumped into, and me simply, calling this person and calling my insurance and fixing their car, fixing their window, that's not going to fix the endemic problem of poverty and the fact that, windows are being broken all over town. I mean, that's true, but it's not really the point. If you as an individual have incurred a duty of justice, you as an individual have a responsibility to find a way to meet that duty of justice. So in some ways, it just doesn't apply to the macro questions. You might think that as nations, there's an analogous way. You might think that the United States, given its role as a prime, if not the prime emitter, as a state actor, has incurred a particular duty of justice, and then the state as a body has some responsibility to make restitution.
And so, and I think that applies to some of the other questions, which are good questions, but maybe not the kind of thing that you're prepared to be able to talk about. Patricia was asking about carbon fees and dividends and things along those lines, which is working at a higher level. Would it?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that because one of the questions is, if let's say this argument catches on that Anthropogenic climate change is real. It is causing harm. When you are harming someone who doesn't deserve that harm and you have not made restitution, you incur a duty of justice. Let's say this argument really gets purchased. What then tends to happen is that this enters the legal system. This becomes codified in a way that the people who are doing this become the ones responsible for it. And then you get into things like carbon tax. You start figuring out ways that we could actually track an individual's emissions. And it's not about shaming them or saying that they're bad people, but saying, look, I mean, it's a bit like having to pay fees when you go to the city dump and you bring your trash. The more you want to bring there, if you live in a municipality that does it that way, you can bring all the trash you want, knock yourself out, but there's a fee that is associated with it, right? And you can't just do it freely and expect someone else to pick up the cost. So if people come to the view that individuals actually are incurring a duty of justice and harms the crucial legal point here, a lot of legal things really do depend on the belief that you are causing demonstrable harm to others. And this is where some of the lawsuits about climate change and carbon emissions have come up, is once you can show that others are being harmed because of your actions, then you take on a not just a moral responsibility, but a legal responsibility. And that may be the way to go, because then once people are, like I said, being hit in the wallet for certain behaviors, I actually think that will reduce reduce the amount of emissions. People won't just say, well, I'll buy my way out of it. They'll find ways to reduce it.
It's another question that again I wonder if it falls out of, because you're really talking about how do we have an argument, how do we understand the argument, how do we ask good questions about the argument and then do these pieces. But people like Kathleen in this example is asking about lifestyle changes that you kind of referenced, that lifestyle changes themselves aren't necessarily going to get us to that point. But how do you know what lifestyle changes, what degree each one reduces one's carbon emissions? How would one go about figuring those kinds of things out? So I don't know if this is an area that you know well enough to answer, but for the audience, I think they're thinking about, okay, how do I go about understanding that?
Yeah, and so this argument it doesn't argue against making particular lifestyle changes. And if you think there's so again, Broom's argument, which is quite severe in some ways, in that it says to meet your duty of justice, your emissions actually have to be zero. If you think about what it would take to be a zero carbon emitter simply by making lifestyle changes, it's arduous to say the least. Now, that doesn't mean, well, therefore, because I can't do it perfectly, it's not worth doing anything, right? I'll continue driving my old gas guzzler rather than using a hybrid, or I'll continue driving to work alone rather than carpooling with a friend. Like it's not an argument against doing other things that would reduce emissions. I think the argument with preventive offsetting is if you're fundamentally focused on the consequences, not what kind of person you are, not the sort of lifestyle you're living, but the consequences of your actions. Meaning, if you think that your emissions are causing harm to other people, what you really need to focus on is how do I get those net emissions to zero? Preventive offsetting is the quickest, most cost-effective, and most efficient way to do it. But it's certainly not an argument against making other lifestyle changes as well.
Keep forgetting that I'm trying to be good and block out my sound. The question from Frederick, I think it gets into some of the other work that I've seen that you've done, right? Which is that harm is also being done by ACC to other than human life, non-human life. How do you define our duty of justice in that context?
That is a great question. That in some ways I was hoping wouldn't come up, because it's a tough one to tackle. All right, so if you're on board at least some way with Broom's argument about duties of justice, that, like I've said many times, anthropogenic climate change is real. It causes harm. If you're an emitter, you are part of that harm. It's harming real identifiable people. You have some duty of justice. The exact same argument, mutatis mutandis, making all the necessary changes, is going to apply to any morally considerable being. So in environmental philosophy, in some ways, the maybe keystone of environmental philosophy is maybe the now obvious realization that human beings are not the only morally considerable beings on the planet. That to take even a simple view, a sentientist view, the idea that any organism that is sentient, that has the capacity to experience pain, pleasure or pain, is then a being that's in a position to be benefited or harmed, right? So this just animals, pick any animal you want. These are sentient creatures, and our actions can either help them and our actions can harm them. So I actually think the argument is going to apply just the same, and it's actually just going to make the argument stronger. It is certainly the case that my emissions, in addition to causing harm to human beings, are certainly causing harm to non-human animals. And to the extent that you believe non-human animals deserve some moral consideration, then all this has done is add more force behind the argument that my duty of justice to therefore get my net emissions to zero is even bigger. I'm not just harming people, I'm harming animals. And if you take an ecocentric view and you believe that ecosystems themselves deserve some moral consideration, anthropogenic climate change is quite clearly harming ecosystems. So again, it's really the same argument. It just adds to the group of people who are being unjustly harmed, or the group of entities that are being unjustly harmed.
Group of sentient entities.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a person on tonight, John, who's putting on a lot of great things about some of the larger policy things that have been mentioned. I'm not going to be able to get them all in here, but we can see if we can get some of that out. One of the things he mentions specifically is a climate policy simulator created by MIT's. It's called En-ROADS, EN-ROADS. I just want to mention that, and we can see if we can get that out in the chat, just because people are really thinking about some of these policy pieces, and I think they're really important. I do want to hit I think, which is so many interesting questions. You've got a lot of really great things in the chat, which we'll send to you afterwards, just to make sure you can see all of this.
Can I just a quick question? If there's anyone who really was disagreeing with any feature of the argument or the presentation, I'd be delighted to entertain that as well. I'm not looking for just agreement here. I disagree with parts of the argument as well.
Well, and I think the closest thing, there's not a lot of disagreement, at least, and I'll ask my colleagues who are also hopefully looking through this. I'm trying to get to what I can. People are really wanting to talk about some of these larger policy pieces. People really want to see how that fits in. There was someone who was, so how do you respond to somebody who said that, yes, there's climate change, but it's God's will, more or less. This is what God intends. How do you respond to an argument like that?
Well, it's not an argument, so I wouldn't respond to it really at all. I would say that's an assertion, and I'm not trying to be flippant. I'd say I'd love to hear your argument for that, and it would probably take us pretty far afield, but it would begin with some sort of argument for their understanding of God, and then why they believe that this is God's will. That sounds to me a little bit like explaining the bubonic plague because God was disappointed in sinners, and I don't know. I suppose that's a view you could take. I don't mean to be particularly dismissive of that. I just think that gets into such complex theological and metaphysical territory that then we're having very, very different arguments. But should that be the case, a lot of people, including me and including John Broome, would need to revise their views.
And I might not have done it justice. I'm sorry. I'm going down so many lists of questions, and I couldn't find that one right while I was referring to it. I apologize. So I think this is a note from Bridget who says, but if I get to zero emissions, then am I still responsible for my emissions from the past?
Yeah, that's a complicated and really, really excellent question. So retroactive harm. And in a strict sense, yes, this would be a kind of restorative justice. I know I keep making different analogies, and I'm not sure how much they're helping or not. But again, if you're just a farmer, you run a plant, and for decades you've been using a certain kind of fertilizer, and let's say you honest to God did not know that fertilizer was causing harm, but you used it for decades and decades and decades, and then it comes to light, and you think, okay, well, going forward, I'll engage in these preventive things such that if there's any harm, I make recompense. But it doesn't, in a way, it morally absolves you from past behavior in that you're not morally culpable if you truly did not know and there isn't any way that you could have known that. And I'm imagining, in some ways, these are relatively new discussions. I don't know that we all grew up thinking that by every time I drive my car, I might be harming other people. So I think it's important to see that you may not be morally culpable for past harm that you really knew nothing about and didn't even know you really should have been preventing. And yet you could still think you have some duty to try and redress that harm that you unwittingly caused. So again, it's not about whether you were a good or bad person, whether you deserve to be shamed or blamed, or wear the environmental hair shirt, or whatever it is. This approach is really focused on the consequences. That if your behavior, wittingly or not, has ended up causing undeserved harm to other people, you really are in a situation that you would want to make recompense. So in that case, yeah, you'd need to think about past harm as well.
So I'm going to get one more question in. There's so many good things in here. Again, I'm sorry. I'm trying to, and it's almost 10 after. I don't want to keep you forever answering questions. Bonnie had a question that was kind of an interesting follow-up on that question about past harm. What if someone made the argument that they didn't cause the past harm, that much of this damage was done before them? Do they still feel responsibility for it? The way she put it was the bulk of the emissions that are causing problems were emitted by others in the past, not your own harm. Yeah. So why blame us now and ask us to make the change? Do I have an obligation?
Yeah, this is where the idea of figuring out, and these in some ways become empirical scientific questions of figuring out what sort of harm is actually being caused and to whom by your particular behavior. And as I at least tried to acknowledge in the presentation, that's very difficult to do. There's no way you're going to be able to figure out if your particular emitted carbon molecules were the ones responsible for causing a respiratory illness in someone in another part of the world. You'll just never be able to figure that out. Maybe two things on that point. I don't know that it's relevant that greater harm was caused by other people and other corporations. So it's certainly true that any individual, the amount of harm that is done by any one individual emitter almost seems insignificant. I mean, it's minuscule compared to what a corporation or a state or some international body does. Just because that you can point to someone else causing greater harm or causing more harm, once again, doesn't resolve you of your particular duty of justice for whatever harm you're responsible for. I do think, though, there is a real trick in figuring out exactly who the victims of the harm are, right? And this is a hard thing to disentangle. People can agree that climate change is real. They can agree that it has an anthropogenic cause. They can agree that it's harming a lot of people. Making that link from an individual emitter to any particular harm that's been done to an actual individual is a bit of a tenuous link. It becomes a bit of a collective action problem. Let me try one last analogy just to see if this helps. There's, you can imagine a scenario like this where you and 11 friends decide to rob a bank. I don't know why you did that, but you did. And you go in and things go wrong, and you pull out your guns, and there's 12 of you, and you each shoot. And it turns out 12 people end up dead, and 12 people were killed by 12 different bullets. But there's some problem at the ballistics lab once you all get arrested, and they can't actually figure out which bullet from your gun went into which person and you killed them. What they can certainly say is, we know for certain a bullet came from your gun and a bullet killed some person. And in some ways, it's not really relevant to know exactly which bullet and exactly which gun and exactly which individual and match that up. It could still be known that you've engaged in some sort of action that has caused harm and there is a clear victim, even if we can't make that chain really, really tight.
Thank you, Josh. There's so many good questions, and I am going to have to cut it off because we're already after 10 after when we were supposed to finish, and I don't want to keep you here all night. And I thank you all, and I hope that we can also provide. What I really hear from people is some if we can send out people who came tonight, some of the resources and some of the things that people can really look at in terms of not only the individual arguments, but how do you think about some of the things that were made, were solutions that were discussed, and also some of the policy pieces. So hopefully we can work with you, Josh, to get some of that out. But thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for getting people thinking really a lot about a lot of these issues, and how to have those discussions and how to think about those moral issues. And thank you all for being here with us tonight. And of course, thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for making this possible, and for those of you out there who are also supporting this work. So we'd love to see you again, both you and Josh, as well as everybody on tonight. We will hope you will join us in a month as we continue to celebrate our 50th anniversary in February, discussing Congress's power of the purse and government shutdowns. So join us for that in February. We'll be sending out the dates. Thank you all, and have a good night.